And good morning from Philadelphia. This is Frank.
And James coming in from Westchester, New York.
And this is UFO News Network Sunday. And today we've got a tremendous guest, Stanton Friedman, longtime UFO researcher, has been one of the, if not the preeminent names in the business since he got started in all this way back, I believe, in the 1960s. And is going to tell us everything he knows about the Betty and Barney Hill case, the Roswell incident, and anything else we can squeeze into our limited time. So, James, Dr. or Mr. Friedman, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning from beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. It's a lovely day today.
Fantastic. So, James, take it away.
Well, first, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Stanton Friedman, for joining us. I have to say, back some probably 20 or more years ago, when I was just a kid in elementary school, I was watching you on TV, amazed and fascinated by the ideas of UFOs and the way you were presenting the information. It was just, it seems so matter of fact to me. So, I'd like to thank you for all the work you've done, making this so public. I know in those times, it is nothing or not as easy as it is today to talk about the subject. And
right.
You coming from a background of nuclear physicist, you had a lot on the line to talk about that kind of stuff. So, major kudos to you for that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate your appreciation.
It's Appreciation Day. So before we get into the meat of some of this, I just want to talk some current events. With the discovery of ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, in December, with the New York Times article and Politico and the Washington Post. I mean, that to me, that just sounds like it feels like that was progress, like incredible news. How do you see that in your deep background and history in the subject?
Well, I was quite surprised to see the article in the sense that it's taken an awful long time for this to come out. And I've been curious, and that my curiosity really hasn't been answered as to why that happened at this time. Who said okay? And, what was the precipitating event? Does this mean something more is going to happen? I kept expecting more to drop, but I haven't heard anything more, really. So I don't know what's going on. I was impressed with Elizondo. I listened to him and the other people. And I'm not surprised. In other words, there had to have been more work going on. But, that ended supposedly in 2012. And, what's happening? Who's pulling the strings? What's going on? I'd like more answers.
Right. And Elizondo claims that the program actually went on after 2012, but we don't have too much on paper about that. And that's become a big mystery in the field that we have a lot of researchers like Paul Dean and others trying to really get to the bottom of. But you do see it as a step forward?
Well, yeah, anything that opens up the box a bit that shows that the government, as one would have to expect, has been busy. I mean, let's face it, we spend an awful lot of effort monitoring the skies to make sure the Russians don't attack us and, all that sort of stuff. There's a huge effort in that. And to suggest that nothing has been going on about UFOs for all those years is nonsense. I worked under security for 14 years. It's standard practice to keep top secret matters top secret. You keep them secret by not telling anybody about them. And so I expect there's an awful lot of data. What's missing so far? So where are the reports that these guys generated? Hey, I worked on 14 years on government-sponsored research and development programs. You always have to write reports, damn it.
We know about one case that we have some detail on, that Nimitz case, and it's a great case, but there's got to be more than one.
You're darn right there does. And so, I don't know who's pulling the strings. I don't know what's going on back there, whether this is a forerunner or just a taste, a tease. I have no idea. I'm mystified. And if the mystery man would stand up and tell us what's happening, I would like to know about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to get on the speculative side, it seems that they're purposely doing some kind of like a slow release of it to drop it like every few months, so it's a constant. It stays in the everybody's focus for for a long period of time. So every few months they'll drop another video, or just I want to say about a month ago. Tom DeLonge posted on his Instagram that him and his team, I'm guessing Jim Semivan, Elizondo, and the rest of the To the Stars Academy team, that were briefing members in Washington. I mean, that's nothing new, because we've had that happen with Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project when it was a little bit more credible, with Dr. Edgar Mitchell was involved, and some others. And we had the citizens hearing, which was a huge event as well, for the public scene to kind of.
I was there.
Yeah, and your speech, you believe it or not, there's a speech on YouTube. It says like Stanton Friedman best UFO citizens hearing speech. It's probably got like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of views, which was excellent. But it seems that that's the plan, that they're keeping the releases partial, so that it stays in everybody's focus over months and months to come. But another revelation about ATIP was it's not such a surprise to people in the field, but it was still big news to be made public that there was a contract with Robert Bigelow Aerospace. And Bigelow has been involved in this for quite a long time.
I was his first research project many years ago he funded.
Exactly where I was going. Have you had involvements with Bigelow, and what are your thoughts on him and his work that he's helped to put out there?
More than 10 years ago, I got a call out of the blue from Robert Bigelow. I had no idea who he was. I actually checked later with people I knew in Las Vegas to make sure he was real. But he sure was. He asked if I had any research ideas. He has some money. Maybe he could be of help. I said, I got a whole bunch of them. Well, send me a list. And I did, and a day later, and 2 days later, he says, pick one, and I did. And I got $16,000 grant from him. And the money was in the bank when he said it would be. And I spent a lot of time looking at MJ-12 and the plains of San Augustine and stuff like that. And as a matter of fact, Bob went on one of the trips out in the middle of nowhere in the plains of San Augustine. I have a great respect for him, not because he's a billionaire, although I suppose that's really a respect in and of itself, but he makes decisions. He was straightforward. It was a pleasure to deal with him. And he wasn't hoity-toity. We were out in the middle of nowhere, staying at a dumpy motel and so forth. He was one of the guys. And so I wasn't surprised to hear he was involved, especially with Senator Reid, being from Las Vegas and stuff. So I have a lot of respect for Bob, and I don't know where all this stuff is going. Who can say who's pulling what strings where for whom? And I think one of the problems we have is that people in the government have been so fearful that the public would panic, would be shocked, or life would come crashing down if they knew that the planet was being visited. I've given more than 700 lectures in all 50 states, 10 provinces, and 19 other countries. I have seen no signs of that at all, and I come on very, very strong. I'm not mealy-mouthed. I don't say maybe it's possible that somebody's coming here. I say the planet's being visited, that there is a cosmic Watergate. It's the biggest story of the millennium, and I cite chapter and verse. And I've seen no signs of people, worrying about what does that mean. I think in today's world, people are prepared for the notion that it would be surprising if there weren't others coming here. And people have come to realize that with all these discoveries about planets, the latest word indicates there's about 1.6 planets per star. So within 100 light years of here, there's 10,000 stars. That means about 16,000 planets. And yet, in 1960, when Frank Drake was talking about listening for signals, he said there might be 6 or 8,000 places that could send signals in the galaxy.
Yeah.
6 or 8 billion is more like it.
Hey, Mr. Friedman, just really quick to jump in. I was going to get to this later on, but now seems as good a time as any. Have you ever sat down and done your own little Drake equation, and what kind of number did you come up with if you did?
Well, I don't, but I think there's life all over the place out there. The Drake equation isn't an equation. You can put any numbers in that you want. And so, it's totally misleading to call it an equation. Equals MC squared. That's an equation. F equals MA. These are equations. So the Drake equation is one approach, and it's amazing. The whole SETI community, I say SETI stands for Silly Effort to Investigate rather than Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, because there's all kinds of evidence that beings are coming here. Why are you talking about listening for signals which maybe nobody is sending using techniques about which you know nothing, when we have all the data? Last month, 2 months ago, MUFON got 650 reports of UFO sightings. Let's say only 10% are aliens. That's still a lot in one month.
That's still amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not like you got to look hard for the data. It's not being recorded terribly well in many places, but in other words, I find that people are not shocked. I've had one guy at the end of one of my lectures said, "How about asking this audience how they feel about flying saucers?" This is after I'd given some Gallup poll data. And I hemmed and hawed a little bit. I said, it's not my job to put you under the microscope. That's my job to stick my neck out. Oh, I don't think anybody will mind, he said. Everybody clapped. So I did ask. More than 90% thought some UFOs are alien spacecraft. And so what's the big deal? You never get 100% on anything, So in today's world, it seems to be generally accepted that, hey, there's nothing special about us. Maybe we're nastier than others, I don't know. But, it's not a big deal. And also, I think people have learned not only that there are lots of planets out there, but that interstellar travel, maybe part of this is from my talking about it, but it's no big deal. At 1g acceleration, it takes less than a year to get to the speed of light. I've had people guess 1,000 years or 100 years. It's 1 lousy year. As you get close to the speed of light, time slows down. And don't ask me why. That sounds crazy, Stan. Of course it sounds crazy, but that's the way God created the universe. What can I say? We've established that. We have accelerators where particles are going 99.9999% of the speed of light. It's not an unknown realm, in other words. So I think people have come around to the notion that it's not a big deal, and our specialness is a product of our own imagination. Every generation likes to think they're it. The great astronomer in the early 1900s said if there's one thing he was sure of, man would never fly any distance in a vehicle. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. In 1956, space travel is utter bilge, said the British astronomer Royal. What good would it do? Who would pay for it? What we need is better tools for astronomy. So Sputnik went up the next year, and the field that's benefited the most has been astronomy from all the space exploration. So we've come around to the notion that it's a big universe, but it's not that big. In other words, also, there's a kind of myth here. People are taught, well, the nearest star to the sun is 4.3 light years away. That's a good ways. But there are loads of places in our local neighborhood where there are stars less than a light year from other stars. The place is crawling with stars and with planets. That was the missing ingredient, Well, you got stars, but where the planets stand? Well, now we know, thanks to Kepler, the satellite, finding planets all over the place. Like I say, 1.6 planets per star. Think about that. So the place is crawling with planets, and our notion of our own specialness, wow, look at us. Look at us. we got a pretty sorry track record. World War II, we only killed 50 million people. I don't know if that's a record for the neighborhood, but it's not something to be proud of. And we spend $1 trillion this year on things military on planet Earth. These aren't nice guys on this planet.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, getting back to the respect about Robert Bigelow, of course, I'm sure you heard on 60 Minutes, and Stephen Bassett pointed out his special "I don't give a damn" line about the reality of UFOs, and he didn't just say UFOs; he said ET presence. He
yes.
flat out said it right on national TV, one of the most watched shows ever.
I admire his guts for doing that, but that's what Bob is all about.
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic. Headway for sure. And talking about the public's perception of this nowadays, it's I almost hate to admit this, I'm a millennial, but the people in my age group, I honestly I've never really met anybody in my generation, and I was born in '87, that really ever question the notion of extraterrestrial life in the universe.
Of course not.
Even UFOs. I mean, we grew up with ET and all these other shows. It was all over the place.
Right.
And we all, it's almost like matter of fact for our generation. Well, it's like, of course there's life out there, because the consensus nowadays is, of course there's life out there, which, some years ago, it was, you couldn't really say that. But nowadays, the consensus for mainstream science is, of course there's life out there. They just argue about, they can't get here yet. But if we're working with civilizations that are even 100 years ahead of us, we couldn't understand their physics for the most part.
How about 1 million?
Yeah, exactly. 1 million, 1,000, 100,000.
But in the 1650s, Bishop Ussher thought that the world was created in 4004 BC, so 6,000 years ago. He left 6 zeros out of there. 6 billion years is closer to it,
Yeah, but getting to the end of the small talk here, what are your thoughts on the term from UFO to UAP? Because Hillary Clinton mentioned that term, and it's been a buzz term since. It hasn't picked up quite as much as UFOs, but people are using it in the research field.
Well, UFO is so much easier to say, and it's been around for so long that everybody knows what you're talking about. UAP sounds very much more sophisticated and covers a bit more ground. And to most people, UFO means alien spacecraft. The UAP could be Russian spacecraft. Who knows? But I don't mind UFO. And most of my lectures I entitle "Flying Saucers Are Real," and I prefer flying saucer to UFO. Because UFOs are all kinds of things. Many different things get labeled as UFOs and then get identified. I'm interested in alien spacecraft. I'm not saying there aren't other interesting things going on. Of course not. I wouldn't dare to say that, because there are interesting things out there. And unlike some people, I don't think we know all there is to know about what's going on in our neighborhood. Every generation thinks it knows it all. Nothing new to be discovered. And in my book, with Kathleen Martin, Science Was Wrong, we have 14 chapters, each one stimulated by some very smart person saying something was impossible who turned out to be wrong. It's not just that man will never fly, which was one of the accepted notions, but there's a whole bunch more of those. Vaccinations wouldn't stop smallpox, et cetera, et cetera. People have been wrong. That's the way of life.
Yeah, and that was a very good book. I remember reading that actually when it came out quite some time ago now. It's a few years ago. They were the one where they thought the person was ridiculous who said if you don't wash your hands after giving childbirth that you can get the next person sick, or dealing with the dead people.
Well, look, what can I say? There are myths all over the place. We do make mistakes. We're not all omnipotent at all. We have to learn to be a little respectful of, maybe there's some stuff we don't know. But if there's one thing we do know is that aliens are visiting. The government won't tell us, and the press isn't pushing, or the scientific community either. I've heard more nonsense from the scientific community. I'm out there on the hustings. 700 lectures is not a trivial amount. 50 states, 10 provinces, 19 other countries. So I got my finger on the pulse. And, I've had 11 hecklers, and I can't remember the last one, and 2 of them were drunk. And I come on very strong, starting every lecture with 4 conclusions. The Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. We're dealing with a cosmic Watergate, meaning some people in government know what's going on. Third, there are no good arguments against the first 2. And fourth, we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. So I'm not a quiet little guy who's hemming and hawing and saying maybe something exciting is going on. And I don't get tomatoes thrown at me, and goodness, no eggs either. And this is from all over, small towns, big countries, small countries. So I don't worry about it when I go out there. I was worried when I started to speak back in first lecture in 1967, I think. How would people react? And the first talk I gave to a section of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. I'm a member of the AIA. It's the biggest group of space scientists in the world. And I was a little worried about what kind of reaction am I going to get? How are these guys going to come at me? And I've never had a problem. So now, it's okay.
In your time, though, you've seen a big change in the public perception about this, right?
Well, no, they've always been receptive, darn it.
Yeah, there you go. That's a better answer. I like to hear that. Now, you're dealing with a lot of hard evidence and facts. You're known for being very down to earth and grounded with your research, dealing with just the facts, getting rid of the speculation, and pointing out how a lot of the facts were actually were kind of smogged by some of what was saying, like with the special report. They were only counting the 3% part when it was a much greater number.
Well, that was interesting. That was one of the earliest examples of clear and unambiguous lying. The press release that went out when Project Blue Book was, released, they didn't distribute it. Special Report 14. It was in 1955. The press release, which got very wide distribution, didn't say who did the work, didn't say what company did the work, what group did the work, and gave none of the data from the report. However, what they did say was the Secretary of the Air Force was quoted as saying, not just anybody, Donald Quarles. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. Well, that's pretty straightforward. It's a lie. The unknowns were 21.5%. I had the report when I looked at the press release. And I was shocked. I'm not accustomed to being lied about, especially by the Secretary of the Air Force, lied too. And that not only that it was 21.5 and not 3, but it was also found that the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. They did a cross comparison between the unknowns and the knowns. The probability that the unknowns are just missed knowns, a chi-square analysis for any mathematicians out there, probably the unknowns are just missed knowns was less than 1%. So we're not talking about, maybe there's something going on. It's clear that there's something going on, and they lied about it. And I don't like that. That's one of the reasons for my quest, if you will. I don't like the public being told lies. I'm not opposed to secrecy as such. I worked under security, and I understand the need for it. But let's not say 3% unknown if it's 21.5%.
Just to jump in, that study was done by Battelle, the Battelle Memorial Institute, and it was actually
their name wasn't on it.
Right. It was actually a pretty good study, wouldn't you agree? The study itself, not the spin on it from the Air Force.
Yeah, the study was an outstanding study. Hundreds of tables, charts, graphs, maps. They asked the right questions, but people didn't know what the results were because the press release was totally misleading. The press release was not issued by Battelle. It was put out by the Air Force.
Now you're dealing with all these the evidence and the hard facts. How did you go from that and then get involved into the infamous Betty and Barney Hill case?
Well, I don't know why it's infamous. I was curious. I read the book, The Interrupted Journey, and then I had been doing programs on KDKA in Pittsburgh, big television station there, and he called me and told me that Betty and Barney, they were bringing Betty and Barney into town. I'd done several appearances on their programs, and they told me where they were staying, which is very unusual. And I called them, and we had dinner together. And I kept listening carefully to see, did they say anything that was different from what was said in the book? And no, they didn't. I was very favorably impressed. And I spent time, was at their home. They're both gone now, of course. But and Kathleen Martin, with whom I've written 3 books, is Betty's niece. And she made a serious effort to find out, was Betty telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth, or just looking for attention or whatever. And no, Betty does have a good imagination. I don't mean that. But so I got interested, and then I was particularly concerned about the star map. And I got a call from Coral Lorenzen, head of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, way back in the 60s. Marjorie Fish was a woman who was trying to do something about the star map that was in the book that Betty supposedly had seen on board the craft. And Marjorie called Coral to find out if she knew any scientists who might be interested in working with her to deal with some of the problems about that. And she asked if it was okay to recommend me, and I said, sure. So I called Marjorie, and I visited with her in Toledo. She's gone now, unfortunately. And I was the first to publish about her work. It was outstanding research. And out of that came the identification of the place, the stars, the names of the stars in the map. And it was amazing that the base stars were the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. Could that be a coincidence? They're only an eighth of a light year apart, not 4 or 5 light years apart. And Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli. So I got heavily involved in that. I was the first to publish an article. I convinced Terry Dickinson, editor of Astronomy Magazine, to do an article. And he talked to lots of people. It wasn't on my say-so. I sent him a copy of my article, and then he talked to all kinds of people. And the article got more response than any article astronomy ever published. And they published a letter, an issue, I think, for the next year in response to that. So I was very heavily involved, and I was very favorably impressed, and I was willing to appear. Betty and I were on the Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder. And, there's a guy I got to give a lot of credit. The first segment Betty was on, and when I came on, they were done in segments, and there was no audience. And I said to Tom, the audience doesn't know that Betty is a social worker. And, maybe it would help recognize that she's not just a nobody. First, we come back on the air, first thing he asks her is about her background. Not everybody will pay attention to what a guest suggests for a question, to tell you the truth, having been out there. So I was very impressed with that. So I've been on that case for a very long time, and it was easy to get connected because I could use my science background, go for the facts, the evidence, the data, find out about stars and which ones are where and how far apart they are. And it's interesting that all the stars in the map turn out to be in a plane, like the planets in our solar system, like pieces of pizza on a piece of salami, I was going to say, on a pizza. They're not floating about in 3 dimensions. They're on the surface. And all the stars in the map are in a plane. Now, that's important because it's much easier to travel if you stay within the same plane, going around the solar system, for example. So I got intrigued by all this stuff and went for the facts and the data. That's what science is all about. And remember, I'm independent. I don't know anybody having to stick to their party line. I can say what I darn please. And some people will tell you I do.
Now, other than the star map aspect of the case, what are some of the other compelling pieces of facts and evidence you think that supported the case?
Well, Dr. Simon, the psychiatrist who did the hypnosis work. Now, here's a man who treated 3,000 people at a veterans hospital, shell-shocked veterans, people who Dr. Simon didn't know anything about flying saucers, but he knew how to deal with people who'd had traumatic experiences and how to get them back online, so to speak. You know, your buddy's head gets blown off in the military next to you. How do you handle that? That's not easy. And he did have to stop one session each with Betty and Barney because the emotional intensity was getting too great. He was worried about it. So he was not a UFO expert, but he sure was an expert about dealing with people who have had traumatic experiences. That was very impressive. You know, that's unusual. He wasn't a party hypnotist kind of thing. This is a world-class expert. 3,000 shell-shock war veterans in World War II is quite a number of people to have to deal with. He knew what he was doing. And so it's funny how the debunkers in all aspects of ufology almost always leave out significant aspects of the investigation. You know, about Betty and Barney or Dr. Simon or all kinds of other ones where they don't bother to mention the important details that help you to understand that this opinion is not from the bottom of the pit. It's from a lofty investigation by people who know what they're doing. So I was very impressed with Betty and Barney and with Dr. Simon. And, you know, it's so easy to take a stand. Well, that's too outlandish. That can't be true. You know, most great discoveries in science were rejected at the beginning because they were too outlandish. You know, sorry, but surprise is a way of life in science.
Now, do you think that the Betty and Barney Hill case is a standalone? That's like the only case of its kind, or you think that
No,
Okay.
I do not at all. There are loads of good abduction cases, and I don't know of another one that had such details on a star map and things like that. But look, the importance of the star map is much more because of Marjorie Fish's work to pin down. That was an incredible piece of work, and I did meet with her. That's not action from a distance. I was the first to publish about it. And I was darn careful about what I said. And I was, like I say, I was very impressed with her, but I also looked at her work. And so it's the only case like that in the sense of where we can pin down a particular star system and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of being a good abduction case, no, Kathleen Marden, with whom I've written 3 books, Betty's niece, has really done a lot of look at experiencers, people who've been abducted. And there are lots of them out there, and trying to get at the facts. I'm not saying there aren't people out there who are putting out baloney. That's true in everything. So I'm not saying every story of an abduction is an honest-to-goodness abduction. I'm not saying that at all. But when the stories get carefully investigated, where facts get checked, data gets sorted, so to speak, there are lots of good abduction cases. Not me. I've never even seen an alien, darn it. Hey, guys.
Yeah. And just for the audience listening, of course, as Stan mentioned, that he co-authored a book called "Capture: The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience." That'll be in the description for people who are interested in that book. But now I think we're gonna get more into the Roswell side of things. Frank, what do you got?
Okay. Well, one thing we didn't mention at the top of the show is that, Stanton, you have announced essentially your retirement from at least actively speaking, writing, and so on. And there's a whole new generation of researchers out there. And you got into the Roswell case in the first place as basically a tip that came to you while you were down in Louisiana, I believe, doing some work. This is probably should go down in UFO research history as the greatest tip ever gotten that you followed up on.
Well, yeah, it was. I was speaking at Louisiana State University, and the students from school had brought me out to a television station. I was supposed to do 3 interviews, and I'd done the interviews. And when I was finished, the guy who had been doing the interviews said, the guy, this is off the air, nobody else around, and not joking, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel, brilliant investigator that I am. I said, who's he? He handled wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What? It was totally out of the blue, and he was serious. This was not a joke he was telling, and there weren't other people around. So well, what do you know about him? He's a great guy. He was the intelligence officer in Roswell, and he was the guy who the guy who was talking to me heard about it because the two of them were ham radio operators, and this Jesse's story was actually in the newspapers in 1947. It was a 2-day wonder until the Air Force said, no, it's just a radar reflector weather balloon combination.
But back in those days, you have no way of knowing any of that. You're just getting a tip from a guy about another guy who said that a saucer crashed. So you know nothing at this point.
Yeah. So the next day, I asked, where does he live? Well, he's over in Houma, Louisiana. I didn't know where that was. But the next day, I called information, and for the young people, that's how we used to get phone numbers. You called information in the right area code, and they could even tell you what part of town it was in, And I got a number for Jesse A. Marcel. Fortunately, his name wasn't Tom Smith. And I spoke with him, and he told me his story. He was the intelligence officer of the 509th. And he talked about the rancher coming in and going to the sheriff, and the sheriff sending him to Jesse, who was the base intelligence officer. And the thing you have to remember about Roswell, that was the home of the most elite military group in the entire world, the 509th. Why do I say that they're the most elite group? They dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped 2 more in Operation Crossroads a couple of years later. Nobody else had atomic bombs at that time. So you had to have high-level security clearance, and you pick your best people for this kind of thing. You don't pick dinks to drop atomic bombs. And the guy I talked to when I first heard about this, and again, it was just by accident. I heard about the Roswell story from this interaction. And I looked in editor and publisher, and there's a newspaper in Roswell. What do I know about Roswell? Why would I know anything about it? So I called the newspaper, and I say, I've got a story here. I wonder if you can help me. Sure. I said, well, it says that a guy named Walter Haut, his name is spelled 2 or 3 different ways. And before I could finish the sentence, she says, his wife works here. What? She works at the newspaper. So I talked to her. And then I talked to Walter, and Walter was indeed the public information officer who put out the story about Roswell, and his name is in the original articles. But at least as important, he was a bombardier who flew 20 missions over Japan and actually dropped one of the nuclear weapons, the instrument package over one of the nuclear weapons explosion in 1946 1977, I guess it was. And you pick your best guy to do that, because we didn't have many atomic bombs to waste at that time. And if you don't have the instrument package, it's a wasted effort. So Walter, and it was well respected in the community of Roswell and all this, and he was a big help to me. He had a base yearbook, shared all that, remembered where a lot of the people still were. I mean, this happened in 47. I talked to him in 78, just a few years later.
At what point are you finally saying to yourself, oh my goodness gracious me, I'm actually onto something here?
Well, it was pretty quick after talking to Walter. I mean, I was impressed with Jesse. I'm a nuclear guy. He's the intelligence officer at the only nuclear group in the world. That says something. Again, you don't pick a dink for that. You know what I mean?
Right. Oh, yeah,
this
absolutely.
Is right after the war. You don't say, anybody volunteer for this job? So I was very impressed with him, and I was impressed with Walter. And Walter gave me, within a year, Bill Moore and I had found 60 people in conjunction with the Roswell incident. His having the yearbook was a big help, and he remembered a lot of the guys and so forth. And you call one guy, and you don't remember anybody else who was there. And at first they'll say, no, it's so long ago. And then, oh, how about Bill Jones? And pretty soon you may wind up with 5 names. And, the last I heard on the Christmas card list, he was living in Oshkosh, stuff like that. So it's hard work, because a lot of times you don't find out anything useful when you call somebody. But we found 60 people within a year and another 30 within another year. But it doesn't just happen, in other words. They don't come running to you. Hey, I understand you're investigating Roswell. Far from it. And, everybody realizes that there's a sort of stigma attached if you say you've seen a flying saucer. And if you're going to talk about a crash flying saucer, boy, you're going to be very careful about opening your mouth. So you have to approach these things cautiously and, get people to understand that you're going to take it seriously. But the people are out there. But you got to go looking for them. Some people are too lazy.
Got it. It's a little easier today, but how far in were you before you actually physically decided to go to Roswell?
That's a good question. I don't know. It was pretty close to the beginning, long before there was a museum there.
Okay. And you also mentioned working with Bill Moore on this. Now, I know he ran into some controversy after the fact.
Oh, yeah.
He was taking some information from Fozy, I believe, and basically spreading some bad information in order to get some good information. Can you tell us a little bit about him before we double back to Roswell?
Well, Bill and I knew each other from a UFO research group in Pittsburgh. And when I heard about Roswell, I shared information with him, and he was a big part of finding those 60 people. He's a persistent investigator. He'd go off to go to 3 research places on the same trip kind of thing. But he got out of it, and sometimes his imagination was a little bit too great, maybe, but he didn't have the same drive. It was different that I did. And he hasn't done anything in ufology for many, many years, as far as I know. So, to each his own. We all have to. Bill, he did a lot of good work. Let's face it. Did he make some mistakes? Yes. All right. Which of us can say that he hasn't made mistakes? So he didn't stick with it terribly long, but long enough to make a real contribution to the research.
Got it. And he got offered, I guess, maybe looking from his perspective, looking back on it now, he might have taken a little bit of a sucker bet from some folks inside the military. Have you ever gotten that kind of an offer? It's like, hey, Stanton, we'll give you this, but you got to go with that.
No.
No. Okay.
I don't know why. Maybe I just don't look like the kind of guy who's gonna, buy it. I don't know.
Got it. Understood. Understood. Getting back to Roswell, the materials research, and a lot of that work was done at Battelle as well. That is especially interesting to me. The materials advancement right after the Roswell era. There's some very interesting developments in that. And
Yes.
also a lot of the materials that were described, shape memory alloys, things like that, suddenly within a relatively short time after the Roswell crash, we're making those kinds of alloys. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah. One of the things I should mention is that I had a contract in the early 1960s to, I'll give you the title, Analysis and Evaluation of Fast and Intermediate Reactors for Space Vehicle Applications. Wow, what the hell does that mean? One word was left out: Soviet. I had a contract, and I worked for Urja General Nucleonics with Air Force Foreign Technology Division to look at Russian technological literature to come up with an evaluation of whether they would be able to use nuclear energy in space. And the reason I got the contract is because I had been working on nuclear systems for space applications. So I knew what we were doing. And I spent a year, and I got the best place to get information about Russian technology was Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus. They had a contract with the Air Force to gather such data. Their connection was classified, and their name isn't mentioned in my final report. I don't have a copy of my final report, as a matter of fact, because it was classified. And I concluded that indeed the Russians were doing everything you need to do to use nuclear energy in space. And it turned out later, I found out, they had launched more than 30, I can't remember if it was 31 or 32, nuclear reactors in space. The United States has launched one, and not a very good one. So the Russians were way ahead of us in that. And the point of nuclear energy in space is it gives you a lot more power per pound. So you can operate sideband radar and all kinds of other stuff, particle beam weapons, all kinds of things, if you got the power. And nuclear energy is the way to get the power. And I knew a lot about small reactors and small radioisotope thermoelectric generators and stuff like that. So I had done that study in the early 60s and was very impressed with what the Russians had been doing because, frankly, they were way ahead of us. And I don't say that because my grandparents were all Russian. That's not the point here. I had to go by facts and data and so forth. So, and I was so glad after I had said the things I said in the classified report that this other data came out that indicated, oh boy, they sure were, you know. So, and most Americans aren't aware of that. You know, there was an attitude back then. You know, these are a bunch of dumb peasants in the Soviet Union. It made some people happy to think that way. And, you know, when General Leslie Groves, who directed the Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons, was asked in 1948, how long would it be before the Russians were able to build an atomic bomb? And he pointed out that they had been devastated by the war in a way the United States hadn't been. And, you know, they had a lot of rebuilding to do and all that sort of thing. And it would probably be at least 8 years. It took 1 year. They, you know, he underestimated them. And sure, they had some spy input. I'm not putting that down. I'm just saying that it was a standard practice. As a matter of fact, we didn't worry about the Russians with atomic bombs because they didn't have any means for delivering them, we thought. We had B-29s. Well, 2 years later, there was a big parade in Moscow, you know, May Day and all that stuff, and there was a whole bunch of big airplanes. And you know what they had done? We had left the B-29 over there, a Lend-Lease aircraft, and it was damaged. And they copied it and built a bunch of them. We underestimated them. And what do? We didn't even have a radar network around the United States. What do we need one for? There's no possibility the Russians are going to cross the ocean and bomb us. Whoops. Oh. Well, I mention this because it doesn't pay to underestimate your enemies.
Moving over a little bit, touching on your nuclear physics background and also a little bit on some of the more recent news regarding the metamaterials that the To the Stars Academy folks have been talking about at least a little bit. I don't have a physical science background, but from what I understand, there have been a number of found at least claimed to be found items from UFOs. And these have been studied actually going back some time. Peter Sturrock, a professor from Stanford, has been involved in this. Jacques Vallée has been involved in this. More recently, Gary Nolan from Stanford has been involved in this, at least to some extent. And apparently, the thing that baffles them, that has really gotten their attention, is that these items, these objects, still have all, they're the same chemical elements that are found on Earth, the same elements. So either titanium or magnesium or whatever the case may be. But the differences that really has these fellows baffled is the differences in the isotopes. That the isotopes can be different, and that is what's gotten them confused. The isotopic ratios. Can you speak? Maybe give us a real quick and dirty tutorial on. Does that sound like it makes some sense to you?
Yes, it does. Look, one of the biggest things about developing the atomic bomb was that we needed to have a lot of uranium-235. Unfortunately, it's only 0.7%. We built a mile-long facility to run loads of uranium-based gas through that facility to separate the isotopes, because the lighter isotope will move a little faster, and the rest of it's 238, so that doesn't move quite as fast. And we were using, believe it or not, in the middle of the war, 5% of all the electricity being generated in the United States to separate those isotopes. In secret, I might add. In secret. So separating isotopes is an important aspect, and there's been an awful lot of work going on. And it's different for different isotopes, how you do it. And, how much concentration you need. So it wouldn't be surprising to me that somebody a little more advanced than we are, 1,000, 1,000,000 years, whatever, knows how to do things that we weren't yet able to do when we found this out. In other words, discovery comes from finding something where you say, gee, how did they do that? Let's see what we can do. And there are all kinds of examples of that in the history of the development of science. But it's one of the things, when we find a piece of Russian equipment or German equipment during the war, we study it like crazy to find out, oh, look what they're using here. Why are they using this or that or the other thing? Oh, and you do your own work. So finding something different is one of the goals when you're doing research on new materials. What's going on here? Why did they put that in there? But you got to check. You got to run a lot of tests. You got to be curious and persistent.
And a lot of that, that work for the Air Force generally gets done out of the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That's the headquarters for that kind of work.
They funded a lot of that. I did, my work was for them, but there are a lot of places where that gets done. People don't realize how much classified work goes on. When I was working, and how big the budgets are, when I was working at General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department, and people say, what? This is back between 1956 and 59 in Cincinnati. General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion. That's what it said on the door. The data was classified. And our budget in 1958 was $100 million. That was a lot of money in 1958. It's a lot of money now, but we employed 3,400 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. That's one company on one project. There were lots of projects. And we never flew a nuclear-powered airplane. We did operate jet engines on nuclear power. But just, people forget. The nuclear navy, we have submarines that can go around the world underwater. In World War II, a submarine could stay underwater for 24 hours. Now they can go around the world. We have aircraft carriers, nuclear powered, that can operate for 18 years without refueling. Think about that for a minute if you're a ship captain. You mean I don't need to go to the gas station for 18 years? Well, it makes all the difference in the world in being able to accomplish your mission. If you don't need to worry about finding a tanker, the oceans are big, and so many people just aren't aware of how big the developments have been and how much money was spent to get there. And it's not just us, the Russians too. As I said, the Russians operated 30-some reactors in space. We operated one. But you don't hear anybody talking to the American people. Oh, you got to learn some more, folks. Yeah, you do.
Got it. Jumping back to Roswell, like with a lot of other UFO cases that come out, a lot of additional claims have come out over the years. Bodies were found as part of the crash, away
Sure.
and apart from where Marcel found some debris and brought went out to the Brazel's location and brought some additional debris back in. Bodies, perhaps one of them surviving, communicating with the military, that type of thing. Anything that you've been able to turn up that would lend credence to those types of claims?
Well, I see no reason not to believe them when I look at the people I heard them from. Jesse didn't say he saw bodies. He said bodies were found.
Okay.
It wouldn't be surprising if there was a crew compartment. Plenty other reports from witnesses. And what can I say? They're operators for the ships. And you think they're going to go public with them? Bring them out for the New York Times to take pictures of? I mean, that's the kicker here, that when you find something like an alien spacecraft, you're not about to go public with, oh yeah, here's the materials we found, and look what they did, something different, and look at the bodies we found. We're talking, what's important about Roswell isn't just advanced technology, but it's proof positive that aliens are visited, that they're more advanced than we are. And let's face it, we don't want to share what we learn about these alien spacecraft with the Russians or anybody else, do we? We're not going to, if they have what they have learned from the crashes over there with what we have learned, they may be able to get there quicker in terms of duplication. And, people think, oh, you got one, now you can build one. That's nonsense. All kinds of things. If you tried to, a $10 transistor radio, give that to the smartest person on the planet in 1935. Could he have built one? Not a chance. He couldn't analyze the chips, and he certainly couldn't duplicate them. So there are huge steps that need to be taken that are very expensive, and that you want to protect the integrity of the knowledge you learn from your possible enemies. Because if they get what you have with what they have, they may beat you to the punch, and you don't want that. The whole point of all this stuff is technology to be used in war, isn't it? I mean, isn't that what it's all about?
At least on the military end, absolutely. Although I got to think that there've got to be plenty of positive civilian uses for a lot of this material too. But getting back to finding an advanced alien craft, you wouldn't be able to figure out the avionics right away. Yeah, you wouldn't be able to duplicate the propulsion right away. But you could figure out what the structural metal alloys were made of. That you could probably do pretty quickly.
Well, you could figure out what they're made of. That doesn't mean you can duplicate them.
Right, exactly.
There are all kinds of processes that go into making advanced materials. If you look at jet engine turbine blades, for example, today, those materials are really exotic in terms of their characteristics at high temperature and pressure. And there was nobody in the world who could build those back, go back enough years. It takes a while to get to that point. Advanced technology, it doesn't come cheap and it doesn't come rapidly. You can see that in all directions around. I mean, if I told you that Moore's law, Moore was a physicist who found, it's called his law because what he discovered was that the number of transistors you can put on a chip doubles about every year or two. That doesn't sound like much until you say that, oh, you mean after 10 years you got 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times,
Right.
Wow. And that doesn't come easy, and you don't publicize how you do it because you've got competitors out there and you've got enemies out there. So there's all kinds of work going on. And as I say, this work isn't cheap and it isn't fast. And you got to be persistent. Somebody's got to pay the freight. I was in that business, and you'd be amazed. The national laboratories, I've been to Oak Ridge and Los Alamos and several other places, and all kinds of great work going on in secret at these places. But it takes money.
And at least if it's a straight private sector initiative, they've got to see some profit in it, too. Unless they can get government funding.
Yeah, they'd like to be able to build more stuff like this. Now, remember, there's a cost factor. If you're building jet engine turbine blades, you really don't care how much they cost. If you can build a plane or an engine that's more powerful than the other guys and can allow you to go 50% faster than the other guy, that's worth an enormous amount of time, money, effort. We're not talking about a 2% improvement. The real world out there is a strange place.
Circling back to Roswell, by most accounts, the ship itself wouldn't be described as a mothership by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
Any thoughts on your part as to whether these types of relatively small ships, considering the distances that need to be covered, are they coming each individual time directly from another star system, or you think they have relatively close by bases? Is it,
motherships?
Motherships, and they're sort of in the neighborhood, and then they drop essentially little scout ships out of them. That's your theory?
Well, or a dozen of them, yeah. Look, we have aircraft carriers that can operate, as I said, for 18 years without refueling. They carry about 75 little airplanes that can operate for 2 hours without refueling. They don't work the same way, in other words. Getting here from another star is an entirely different problem than once you're in the atmosphere, you're zipping around in the atmosphere where you've got air to create drag and heating and all that sort of thing. They're two different problems.
Okay.
And so we got motherships and we got Earth excursion modules, as I prefer to call them.
Got it.
EEMs. And it makes sense, is what I'm saying. There's nothing surprising about that.
Okay.
There's not much going on between the stars. But when you're in the atmosphere and you got to worry about heating and drag and radar profile and plasmas and all kinds of stuff, that's another ballgame. And incidentally, way back in 1962, makes me feel old, worked on fusion propulsion systems for deep space travel. And a conclusion of our study, which was headed by the guy who had headed the fusion research at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, John Luce, brilliant man, probably the smartest guy I ever worked for. The conclusion of our study, we only spent $9 million on the study. We didn't build anything. Was that if you want to go, all it takes is dough. A lot of it. Well, I mean, that's the thing you have to be concerned about. It's not 6 professors sitting around the table with 8 grad students. Oh, we'll get this done next month, guys. Like I said, at GEANP, we employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. and spent $100 million in 1 year in 1958. So you need some idea of the scope of the project. It's one thing to say, can you do it? Another is how much it's going to cost and how many people you're going to need. That's a different sort of question.
Got it. Okay. James, you have any follow-ups for Mr. Friedman?
Oh yeah. I just want to make a small comment on the metamaterials. Also, aside from some of the stuff that was mentioned by Jacques Vallée, that it seemed that Jeremy Corbell is alluding to the idea that the patients that Roger Leo were working with, and in his movie that he put out, Patient 17, that those implants were also had the elements in the alleged implants from these people who were claiming abduction had these anomalous isotopes. So that's I just wanted to add that comment in there, and also in his upcoming film, Hunt for the Skinwalker, about Skinwalker Ranch, I think he also alluded to that some metamaterials might have been recovered around there. But getting back to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, I know, Stan, that you are very strong about that idea.
Yes.
That these are in fact aliens and extraterrestrials, and possibly other things, but for certain that there is that extraterrestrial element. What do you think that their purpose is here? Especially,
well, one of my papers, I think I listed 20 reasons for coming here. One of them is to keep us from going out there. We're a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. We are a threat to the neighborhood. Sit back a little bit. We have exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. Once you've figured out fission and fusion, you can go to bother your neighbors. Well, look at the progression. It's a huge progression. A big bomb in 1944 was a 10-ton blockbuster. Wow, released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite, one bomb, and it took a big airplane to carry it. 1945, first fission atomic bomb released the energy of 15,000 tons of dynamite. So you go from 10 to 15,000. Our first H-bomb, a fusion device, 1952. First A-bomb was 45. 1952, our first fusion device released the energy of 10 million tons of dynamite. One stinking weapon. And the Russians in about 1960 or so set off, I don't know how else to put it, exploded Tsar Bomba, 50 million tons of TNT. That's how much energy was released with that one weapon. And you see, as soon as you get to talking about that kinds of energy, then the stars are within reach. I'm not saying it's cheap. You don't go down to the Walmarts and I need 2 fusion devices, please. But it becomes feasible, and we haven't been at it that long. So everybody out there knows these idiots on Earth are a threat to the neighborhood. I say threat. I don't like the idea we Earthlings killed 50 million people in World War II. 50 million people. We're not nice guys. So that's the first thing. They want to keep us from going out there. Secondly, they want to know how rapidly we are advancing. Third, they want to know if there are goodies here that they can steal from here that are depleted elsewhere. It's not just uranium that's interesting. That was used as a coloring agent back 100 years ago. Certainly had nothing to do with atomic energy. We didn't know anything about atomic energy. So the Earth may be somebody's colony, maybe somebody's crop. We may have been planted here. It was a penal colony. They dumped all the bad boys and girls here, and that's why we're so nasty to each other. But, you don't have to look to find reasons why anybody would want to come here. Graduate students doing their thesis research on the development of a primitive society, and we are a primitive society, finding out if we've learned any. Maybe they're looking for certain kinds of DNA. Pick up 1,000 specimens, and maybe 2 have. Oh, look what we found! And I say that because we know that we're often looking for the unusual, the small percentage of what is that, and what does it do when we put it into some other material. So I think they may be checking on their own colonies, of course, and they're getting ready to work a deal, or they're, aliens are buying with each other. How can we get these idiots on our side? We need a bad side. Look at all the reasons the guys crossed the ocean back a few hundred years ago. Yeah, a lot of them were looking for gold. Some of them were looking for slaves. And there are plenty of other things. Potatoes came out of the New World, didn't they? Potatoes are important here too, for that matter.
And now, doubling back here on the some of the recent news, it seems pretty clear that even though they keep generally a pretty low profile, there are a fair number of scientists, working scientists, who are interested in this subject, and they have done a few things in the field. Jacques Vallée wrote a book a few years ago called The Invisible College. And
Yes.
we're basically, there are these guys who for years, even though they, like I said, they do keep a low profile, who have had some interest, done at least some research on the subject. Have you ever been in contact with any of those fellas? Do you have a list of guys who say, yeah, Stanton, keep my name out of this, but I've got something for you, or vice versa?
Well, that occasionally happens. Remember, I worked under security for 14 years. Jacques didn't. So I had some insider situations, and at 4 or 5 different companies. I'm not exactly proud of that, but at least I was able to get a job when the program ended.
Right.
We talk to each other. There are different backgrounds, different people, and not many of them around. One of the people I respect the most is Dr. Bruce Maccabee, for example, an optical physicist who worked at a Navy research lab for over 30 years under security. And he's done some interesting work on electromagnetic effects and all that sort of stuff. There aren't too many like that we know about. But in other words, these guys come out from under.
Yeah, Bruce is Dr. Maccabee's pretty upfront, and he's very public about his interest. But it does seem like there are at least a few others that have kept that low profile. They've pretty much stayed under the radar. But they have been helpful at times, at least in your case.
Yeah, I'd say so, and it's good to have somebody to talk to. Look, the boundaries between classified world and unclassified are pretty sturdy. I get people telling me, oh, this guy, MJ-12, I've written a whole book, Top Secret Magic, MAJIC, about this group set up by President Truman, and some people will say, oh, that's all phony. It isn't phony. They say those guys would have told their wives what they were doing. Of course they wouldn't.
No, they wouldn't have done that. I've talked to enough people who've confirmed that.
Yeah, I mean, I never told my wife anything classified. I'd be breaking the law, for one thing. She doesn't have a clearance or a need to know. Those are the 2 vital parts. Curiosity isn't enough. A lot of people think, well, surely they would have told this guy or that guy. No, that's not how the system works.
Got it. I've got one final question on my end. I do follow the SETI type research, the exoplanet hunters and all that. And one guy whose name comes up on a pretty regular basis is a fellow named Abraham Loeb out of Harvard. And he had written a rather interesting article. I thought it was interesting because I thought it had a direct connection with UFOs, where he was talking about this exoplanet study is going to be a little tricky for the simple reason that there really is never going to be an exoplanet discipline, that it's going to take multiple disciplines, chemists, physicists, all manner of different scientists to really get a good grip on this subject. And I see the same sort of thing in the UFO research field. You've got somebody like you coming from a physics background. Well, and you've made your contributions. That's great, but I want to contribute too. I'm not a physicist, but I like to think that I've turned up a few things here and there that are interesting, and I've helped in my own way. James helps in his own way. Lots of people come to the field from different backgrounds, have skill sets, knowledge bases that can help out to some extent. And if you could send us off, you said you're wrapping things up. Give us all a good pep talk about what we can do with this very exciting field going forward.
Well, there are a lot of things we can do. One of them is to develop new technology. Two is to recognize openly, many people recognize it, but not openly, that indeed the planet is being visited, and that has some implications. What do they know that we don't know? What do the governments know that we don't know? What do these guys intend here? Are they going to gather data and say, the heck with these idiots, and wipe us out? Who knows what their intentions are? I certainly don't know. I think these are areas of considerable interest. But remember, governments don't want to tell anybody else anything new that they've learned because it has potential implications for national security. To say that you've just found a new material that'll do A, B, and C, you don't put that out in the open because of the potential military applications. And the military budget on the planet is about $1 trillion this year. That's a crime, as far as I'm concerned. We got plenty of starving kids. We should feed them. So, we live in a peculiar world. What are there? I don't know what the last count is, 190 different countries. We don't have an earthling society. We have a whole bunch of different nationalistic groups. So we got a lot to learn, and I'm sure one of the groups coming here must be historians trying to figure out how do these idiots keep up this crazy approach. They live on a small planet, got all kinds of goodies, and they're keeping secret from each other, and they're all working separately, and their big thing is military. These guys are nuts. That's why I say this was a penal colony. They dumped the bad boys. In other words, when you stand back and look at this thing, there are a lot of aspects that are very interesting and very indicative of how little effort we make to act as people on a planet. I'm an earthling, and you're an earthling, I think.
As far as I know.
But you see my point.
Yep.
That we're a separated society. We're not a together society. It's expensive.
Yeah, just as a little aside, sometimes I can be a bit of a data nut. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but the UN does a study roughly every year where they poll people in every country they can, and they have a happiness ranking. Have you ever seen that in the news? They usually give it a little bit of publicity each year when it comes out.
Well, I have seen little blurbs in the paper, but I haven't looked at the data.
Oh, okay. It's kind of interesting in that if you look at the happiest countries in the world, what you find is they tend not to have really large populations. I thought that was a really interesting little connection there, that the larger countries tend to be a little bit further down. So I do hear a lot of talk about one world government and things like that, but it seems to me that maybe the largest governments in the world don't keep their people very happy, and that maybe smaller...
Right.
Less of a smaller population to keep happy is an easier job.
It could be. I don't know.
Well,
Frank, I hope you're not giving anybody any ideas, if you know what I mean.
Well, I just thought it was interesting. I was
absolutely.
The U.S. actually holds up pretty well for such a large country, but we are not even close to the top 10 in terms of the world's happiest people. Canada is, by the way. I notice you're living up there, but the population in Canada is a lot less than it is in the States.
It's fewer people in California.
Yep. And well, I guess the more people you've got under your government could be no proof obviously, but could be a much more difficult job governing. So
It wouldn't surprise me.
yep. Okay,
Well,
so that's what I've
I
got.
just want,
Oh, go ahead, James.
yeah, I just want, very briefly, I'm going to throw out two names, Stan, and if you wouldn't mind just giving brief commentary. I know you've gone over one of the names before. I want to see if you have any idea changes or insight on that. Is Bob Lazar to this day, because his story is resurfacing now, and there's going to be more publicity about that in the coming months. Has any of your previous commentary changed on that?
No, he's a bright guy. I don't deny that at all. He's not a scientist. He certainly lied about his academic background. He didn't go to MIT or to Caltech. And I don't believe his story, other than that he certainly is interested in the subject. And look, George Knapp and I are friends, I would say, and I don't believe him about Lazar, and he knows where I stand. He doesn't believe Bob has those degrees either. But I say, once a guy starts lying about his degrees, why should I believe him about anything else? But you notice Bob has not published anything. Scientists normally publish papers. They write books. They do all kinds of stuff. And Bob has done none of those. So he's got a story to tell, and he's a good storyteller, and he's a bright guy. I give him that. But I don't believe him that he had anything to do with back engineering flying saucers. Why would he? He's not a scientist.
Yeah, that's fine. So moving on, I know we have a friend, Ryan. He has a YouTube called Post Disclosure World, and he's also known as UFO Jesus. Believe it or not, he's a hilarious guy, great channel. But I know he'd want me to ask this question. What do you think about the Travis Walton case? Just briefly.
Well, I met with Travis many, many years ago, and I've been with him out where the event took place. I'm a fan of his. We've done programs together, and he was surprised that I stood behind him instead of saying, well, I think he believes that he's telling the truth. I say, I believe him. And he was very pleased about that. I'm very favorably impressed with Travis. Sharp guy.
Excellent. Yeah, because that was an excellent case. And Frank touched on this lately, but just closing out here, what do you think that going forward, what would you leave? Because of course you're retiring soon. God bless you. You had such a run that the next generation of researchers can do in the field of ufology to take this forward.
Well, I think for one thing, they can become familiar. I just looked at a bibliography, and there are dozens now of PhD theses that people don't know about, done about UFOs. They can become familiar with the evidence instead of just arguing theoretically about, oh, I think they're real or I don't think they're real, or, why don't they do this, that, or the other thing. I think we could do more information sharing. I think we could do more pressure on the government. I think that the scientists need to have guts enough to study the evidence instead of make profound statements that have no basis in fact. Nasty, noisy negativism is not a way to be a scientist. There's a lot of that going on. So I think do your homework is the first thing. I shock people when you say they're a PhD thesis. Yeah. In a book I wrote more than 10 years ago, I listed 10 of them, and the number is well up over 30 now. Don't tell me there's no data. Do your homework. That's the big thing. They can read my books. I've got 6 books out there. I autograph them all when I send them out. They're listed at my website, www.stantonfriedman.com. No charge for the autograph. But there is plenty of data that people don't seem to be aware of, and that's a shame. If you're going to have an opinion about something as complicated as this, you should have the facts, not the maybes and the possibles, the reality.
Well, and in the description of this video, we will have the links to all your books, your website, and I'm going to hunt down some of the the PhD theses that you're talking about as well, and try to include as much as that, so
Good.
people can be familiar with that and try to put it out there. But I just want to say again, Stan, thank you so much for all the work you've done in this field. Again, like over 20 years ago, when I was a kid watching you on TV, I'd never imagined that I'd be sitting on the other side doing an interview with you. So that's just an amazing to me. That's that's I can take that off my bucket list now.
You didn't think I'd live this long. That's what it is.
No,
I will
had
second
no
that.
idea.
I will second that. Yeah, this has been fantastic. Thank you
I
so
had
very much for coming on.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine that I'd be doing this that that long ago, watching those programs on TV as a in elementary school, that I'd be doing all this. I had no idea. So it's been a complete honor. And I really congratulate you on everything, and that I hope that you have an amazing retirement. You deserve it. I mean, you're a machine going at this so hard for so long.
Well, both my parents lived to be 90, so I got 6 years more to go.
No, I think you got more than that.
My understanding is it's basically a retirement from writing, lecturing, more actively traveling around. But you're still going to be keeping an eye on things. Is that correct?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay. So if something hot drops, it's certainly okay after July, which is, I believe, your last scheduled seminar presentation. You'd still be willing to come back on with us and let us know everything you think about.
Oh yeah.
All right. That's good to know. That is fantastic to know.
All right. Take it easy.
Thank you, Stanton Friedman. Thank you so very much for joining us. And James, I believe this was a very good interview. Found out some very interesting things that we didn't know about before. And do you have anything else before we wrap up here?
No, that's about it. I mean, that was excellent. Again, it was honor to speak to Stan.
It was,
Friedman,
and he delivered on the information too, which is the main thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was glad to ask him about some of those things, especially the Travis Walton case. I didn't know he was so behind that. It's excellent.
Okay, so I will let you go. We will wrap up the show. If you picked it up midway through, the full video should be available, and we will post the link all over the place at our Facebook accounts and over at Twitter. So you should be able to pick it up from the beginning and listen to it at your convenience. So everybody else, you have a great day, and join us again. We don't have a show scheduled for next week. Our original plan was to do 7 shows before Memorial Day. This was our 7th, so we may or may not come up with something next week, and certainly Memorial Day weekend we'll be taking that off. So one way or the other, we'll be seeing you at the very least in June. I believe Chris Wolford is going to be joining us talking about his experiences. He's an experiencer and also has some experience in dealing with the Kit Green, Gary Nolan study of experiencers. So we'll be talking about that in all sorts of detail. We've also got Dr. Adam Dodd from the University of Queensland coming on next month, talking about scientists and UFOs. And later in the month, we've got Dr. Lynn Katai scheduled to talk about the Phoenix Lights incident.
Yeah, and I think we might have another midweek one coming up, so we might surprise you guys.
All right.
And I also wanted to say, Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. We love
Happy
you.
Mom's
We couldn't
Day.
have done any of this without you. We need the mothers. I just wanted to put that out there.
There we go. All righty. And that's about it on my end. Do you have anything else, James?
No, that's it. I got it.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.
My little mom and wife out.
There
Take
you
care,
go.
everybody.
Have a good
Bye.
one. Bye-bye.